The day my mother found out her beach house was gone, the sea was calm, unnervingly calm, like it was holding its breath for her. She stood at the window in her faded blue robe, the same one she'd worn since I was a boy, and asked, almost absently, "When are we going?" And I said the words I'd rehearsed 100 times but never truly believed I'd say. "We're leaving tomorrow, Mom. I sold your beach house." For a moment, she didn't respond. Just stared at the horizon, that thin line between sky and water she'd always called God's eyelid. Then she nodded, as if I'd told her something ordinary, like the tide schedule or the price of milk. But I saw it, the flicker, the quiet collapsing inside her eyes. What she didn't realize was that this house, this tiny wooden frame clinging to the edge of the Pacific, was more than wood and salt-stained glass. It was our last tether, to my father, to summers that smelled of coconut oil and sunburn, to the version of her that still laughed. And what I didn't realize, not yet, was that selling it would unravel more than her memories. It would unravel me. There are moments that split your life cleanly in two, before and after. Before, I was a son trying to do the right thing. After, I became the man who took everything from the woman who gave me everything. People think heartbreak is loud, that it comes with screaming, breaking things, slamming doors. But sometimes it's quiet. It's a single look across a breakfast table. It's the way someone folds their hands so they don't shake. That morning, my mother buttered her toast, humming the same off-key tune she always hummed when she was hiding something. The sun caught the silver in her hair. The ocean outside shimmered like it knew we were saying goodbye. I told myself I did it for her, to protect her, to move her closer to the care she needed, to keep her safe. But that was a lie I wrapped in good intentions. Because the truth, the real, heavy truth, was that I sold the house out of fear. Fear of what she was becoming. Fear of losing her piece by piece. Fear that if I stayed, I'd drown too. And now, as I sit here in the empty living room, walls breathing with the ghosts of our laughter, I can still hear her voice from that day, calm, steady, and breaking just beneath the surface. "It's only a house, darling. The sea will remember us anyway." But I know better now. The sea forgets everything, eventually. The house had always felt alive. Not in the way people say old houses breathe, but in the way it listened. Every creak of its floorboards, every whisper of wind through its salt-warped windows, it remembered. It had been built in 1964 by my father, with hands that never stopped moving. My mother used to say he didn't build the house to live in it. He built it so love had somewhere to go. He'd carved our initials into the support beam in the kitchen, right below the window that faced the sea. M+L+S, Margaret, Leo, and Sam. Back then, it meant we were permanent. But nothing ever is. My name is Sam Keller, and I've spent most of my life trying to outrun the sound of waves. I live 3 hours inland now, in a city where the air smells like metal and ambition. I work in real estate development, which is ironic, considering how much I once hated men like me, men who bought beauty, broke it apart, and sold it off in pieces. I tell myself I help families find homes. But deep down, I know I've made a career out of what my father used to call pretty theft. When he died, I was 28. My mother stayed at the beach house, insisting the ocean was all the company she needed. "Don't worry about me, love," she'd say over the phone, her voice light and distant. "I have the sea, the gulls, and my crossword puzzles. What more could an old woman want?" For years, I believed her. I wanted to, until her memory began to slip like sand through a sieve. Margaret Keller wasn't the kind of woman who grew old quietly. Even in her 60s, she wore red lipstick and a defiant smile, as if daring time to take her youth. She laughed loudly, cursed freely, and danced barefoot in the kitchen to Sinatra. But after my father died, her laughter became more like a photograph, something you could look at but not touch. At first, it was little things. She'd forget her keys, burn the kettle dry, call me twice in one afternoon to tell me the same story about a pelican landing on the porch. I told myself it was harmless, just age, just distraction. Then came the day she left the stove on. The fire was small, thank God, but the fear it left behind was not. I drove down that night and found her standing outside in her nightgown, staring at the smoke curling from the kitchen window. She looked lost. "Mom," I said, grabbing her shoulders, "what happened?" She blinked, as if surprised I was there. "I was making tea," she whispered. "Then I went to find the sugar. When I came back, the water was gone. The pot was gone." She started to cry. It was the first time I'd ever seen my mother cry like that, not out of grief, but confusion. as if the world had quietly rewritten itself and forgotten to tell her. That night I stayed in the guest room, listening to her move about the house, opening drawers, closing them again, humming off-key the way she always did when she was trying to stay calm. Every sound of that house, from the soft moan of its beams to the crash of the surf beyond the porch, carried a strange sadness, like the house itself knew it was losing her too. Every corner of that home was a map of our lives. The sun-bleached family photos lining the hallway, the chipped blue paint on the porch where my father had dropped a ladder in '72, the back door that never quite closed unless you gave it a kick. I spent my childhood summers there, barefoot, skin salty, hair full of wind. My friends used to call it the edge, because it sat at the very tip of the bluff, one more storm away from tumbling into the Pacific. Mom refused to leave even after the cliff started to erode. "Let the sea take it when it's ready," she'd say. "It'll know when I'm gone." I used to roll my eyes, but secretly, I understood. That house was the last living piece of my father. And for her, it wasn't just a home. It was the memory of being loved. Then came the call that changed everything. It was early spring, the kind of day when the world still smelled faintly of winter. Mrs. Duval, the neighbor down the coast, spoke softly on the phone. "Sam," she said, "your mother's not well." Apparently, she'd wandered into town barefoot, carrying a photo album and asking people if they'd seen her husband. My father had been gone for over a decade. When I arrived, she didn't recognize me at first. She was sitting on the porch, watching the waves roll in, her hair tangled by the wind. "Can I help you, young man?" she asked, polite as a stranger. My throat tightened. "It's me, Mom," I said. "It's Sam." She squinted, her eyes scanning my face like a puzzle she used to know how to solve. Then, slowly, she smiled. "Sammy, you look like your father. He used to come home smelling of sawdust and salt. You remember that smell?" I did. I remembered everything she couldn't. That night, I sat in her old armchair, the one with the threadbow arms and the faint scent of lavender oil, and listened to the sea hitting the rocks, slow and rhythmic. The same lullaby that had raised me. And I knew, with a heaviness that made my chest ache, that I couldn't leave her there anymore. Over the next few weeks, I tried to convince her to move inland, closer to me. She'd laugh and wave me off. "Oh, don't be dramatic, love. I'm fine here. I have the sea to talk to." But then I'd find the milk in the pantry, or her shoes in the oven, or a half-eaten sandwich on the bathroom counter. Her world was unraveling, thread by thread, and no amount of love could stitch it back together. One afternoon, I came into the kitchen and found her talking to my father's photograph. "You shouldn't have gone so soon," she was whispering. "I told you the house would fall apart without you." She turned to me, smiling softly. "He's just teasing me, you know. Says I never could fix a door right." I smiled back, because what else could I do? But inside, I felt something splinter, a helplessness that scared me more than anything. That's when the idea began to take root. Sell the house, move her somewhere safe, somewhere closer. Somewhere she couldn't forget herself so easily. I told myself it was practical, even merciful. But the truth was, it was also selfish. Every time I walked into that house, I saw pieces of my father everywhere. His tools in the shed, his handwriting on the pantry jars, his ghost in the walls. The house had become a museum of things I couldn't bear to feel anymore. Still, I hesitated. Selling it felt like erasing them both. Then one morning, while she was napping, I stood in the living room and looked around. The light fell across the floorboards just the way it did when I was a kid. Dust floated in the air like memory. The house creaked as the tide pulled out, as if sighing. That's when I made the decision. Quick, quiet, irreversible. I listed it the next week. The market was strong, and within a month I had a buyer, a young couple from the city, thrilled to own a piece of oceanfront paradise. They didn't see the cracks in the foundation or the ghosts in the beams. They saw sunsets and cocktails and summer laughter. I signed the papers in my office, my hand shaking just slightly. My assistant congratulated me on the sale. "That's a big one," she said. I smiled, but it felt like swallowing glass. I didn't tell my mother right away. I couldn't. I told myself I'd wait for the right moment, but there's never a right moment to break someone's heart. When I finally did, the day she stood at that window, the sea calm and endless, I thought I was ready. "We're leaving tomorrow, Mom," I told her. "I sold your beach house." She didn't shout, didn't cry, just nodded slowly, eyes on the horizon. "It's only a house, darling," she said. "The sea will remember us anyway." But I saw the tremor in her hands, the way her lips pressed together like she was holding something back. That night, as she slept in her old room for the last time, I sat in the living room surrounded by boxes and silence. The ocean outside was restless, as if it knew what I'd done. And though I told myself I'd done the right thing, a part of me, the boy who once carved his initials into the kitchen beam, knew better. Because the sea doesn't remember. It only takes. The morning after I told her, the sea turned violent. Waves slammed the rocks like fists, spraying salt through the open kitchen windows. It was as if the ocean itself had heard the news and decided to rage for her. I woke to the sound of shutters banging, the smell of coffee already burning on the stove. Mom was standing there, barefoot, robe flapping in the wind, staring at the pot as if it might explain something. "Storm's coming," she said quietly. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were elsewhere, fixed on the horizon where the water was boiling white. I wanted to tell her she'd be safer inland, that the new apartment would be easier, that she'd have a nurse to help her remember. But every word felt like a betrayal wearing good manners. She turned to me. "Do you know what the sea hates most?" I shook my head. "Being caged. You can't put the ocean in a box, Sam. That's what you've done. You've sold its freedom." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Her disappointment was quieter than anger but twice as heavy. All day she packed little things, shells, old postcards, a chipped mug that once belonged to my father. She moved through the rooms like a ghost cataloguing her own afterlife. I followed, trying to help, but she brushed me off. "Don't worry, I'll leave the floors clean for them," she said, meaning the buyers. "Mom, you don't have to." She cut me off with a look. "It's still my house until tomorrow, isn't it?" That night, the storm hit full force. The house groaned against the wind. Rain hammered the roof like 1,000 tiny accusations. I couldn't sleep, so I walked down the hall, pausing outside her room. Light spilled from beneath the door. I knocked softly. "Come in, Sam." She was sitting up in bed, a photo album open across her lap. The lamp threw a warm circle of light around her, making everything outside it feel unreachable. She pointed to a picture, me, age 6, holding a kite, my father's hand steadying mine. "He made that kite from an old sail," she said. "You cried when it tore." "I remember. He told you the wind only breaks what tries to resist it." She smiled faintly. "You've been resisting ever since." I sat beside her. The pages smelled faintly of sea salt and thyme. "I did what I had to, Mom," I whispered. She closed the album. "Maybe. But sometimes what we call protection is just fear wearing clean clothes." Her words cut deeper than she knew. Because she was right, I'd sold the house not out of duty but out of dread. Dread of watching her fade, dread of losing her in the rooms where she'd once been so alive. When the power went out an hour later, the world fell into black silence except for the sea. I could hear it breathing beyond the walls, slow, relentless, eternal. At dawn the storm eased. The air smelled of wet earth and salt. We loaded her boxes into my car, each one labeled in her precise, looping script, kitchen memories, winter scarves, Leo's tools. She stood on the porch one last time, robe fluttering, eyes scanning the endless grey water. "Did you know," she said softly, "that salt preserves?" I nodded, not sure what she meant. "That's why the sea keeps secrets longer than people do." Then she handed me a small, salt-stained envelope. "Don't open this until we're gone." We drove in silence for the first hour. The road wound inland, leaving behind the smell of brine for the dry hum of eucalyptus and dust. When the house disappeared from the rearview mirror, she reached out and rested her hand on mine. "You did what you thought was right," she said. "That's what makes it hurt so much." I wanted to tell her I was sorry, that I'd undo it all if I could. But words felt useless beside her quiet grace. She fell asleep soon after, her head resting against the window, the light flickering over her face like passing waves. I looked at her reflection and wondered how much longer I'd have her, not in body, but in memory. When we reached the new place, a tidy, modern apartment with beige walls and a balcony that overlooked nothing, she smiled politely, as if visiting someone else's life. "It's lovely, Sam," she said. "Truly." But when I helped her unpack, she opened a box labeled Leo's tools and found only air. She stared inside, confused. "Did you forget to load it?" I froze. There had never been a box of tools. I'd labeled it myself, not wanting her to know they were gone, sold at an estate auction with the rest. She looked up at me, eyes cloudy but searching. I could have sworn. "It's okay, Mom," I said quickly. "We'll find them later." She nodded, But her face fell into that small, distant expression I'd come to dread, the look of someone standing on a shoreline, watching pieces of themselves drift away. That night, after she'd gone to bed, I sat alone on the balcony with the envelope she'd given me. The paper was brittle, edges curled from years of sea air. Inside was a folded letter in her handwriting and a Polaroid of her and my father, younger, sun-drunk, laughing with the surf behind them. The letter read, "Sam, if you ever have to let go of the house, promise me you'll listen to the sea one last time before you go. It has something to tell you. Something your father never got to say. Love, Mom." I stared at the words until they blurred. The city lights below were sharp, foreign. For the first time, the silence felt like punishment. I'd thought I could trade salt air for safety, memory for order. But already the walls around me felt too clean, too quiet, too far from the heartbeat of waves. For the first few weeks, my mother tried to pretend the apartment was home. She filled the silence with routine, as if routine itself could hold her memories together. Every morning she made tea, humming Sinatra's "Fly Me to the Moon," the tune slightly off-key, the way it always had been. She arranged her seashells on the windowsill, lining them by color. The balcony caught a thin slice of sunlight in the afternoons, and sometimes she'd sit there for hours, eyes closed, face tilted toward a sky that no longer smelled of salt. I tried to be there as much as I could. I'd stop by after work, bringing her fresh flowers, groceries, small lies. "You're looking stronger, Mom. You're remembering better." Lies meant to soften both of us. But the apartment felt too still, too obedient. There was no sea wind to rattle it, no shifting light to remind her what time it was. She began losing track of hours. Some nights I'd find her dressed and ready for church at 2 in the morning. One afternoon I came in to find her sitting on the floor of the living room, surrounded by open boxes. Photographs, old letters, faded postcards were scattered around her like fallen leaves. She was crying quietly, her tears landing on the paper without sound. "They don't belong here," she said when she saw me. "They can't breathe." She lifted a photo of my father, his arms slung around her shoulders, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. He looks trapped behind glass. I knelt beside her, helping gather the photos. "We can hang them up," I said. "Make it feel like the old place." She shook her head. The house remembered the laughter. "These walls don't know our voices yet." She didn't know, couldn't know, that the old house was already being gutted by its new owners, walls torn down, deck replaced, the kitchen open to the view. I'd seen the pictures online, accidentally, and stared at them until guilt pulsed behind my eyes. The beam with our initials was gone. Just gone. I began dreaming of the sea again. Dreams where the tide came for the house, waves climbing the bluff like fingers, pulling it piece by piece into the dark. Sometimes my father was standing in the surf, calling my name, but his mouth moved without sound. I'd wake drenched in sweat, the city night pressing against the window, the air too dry to breathe. Mom grew smaller in those weeks. Her hair thinned, her steps slowed. She'd call me by my father's name more often than my own. "Leo," she'd whisper, touching my arm. "Do you think he forgives me?" I never knew which she meant, God, me, or the sea. One evening, after another long day of work and pretending everything was fine, I found her standing at the kitchen sink, staring down at a teacup filled with water. "Listen," she said, holding it toward me. "If you listen closely, you can still hear the tide." I humoured her, leaning close, hearing nothing but silence and porcelain. But she smiled, convinced. "You just have to remember what it used to sound like." Later that night, I took the letter she'd given me, the one that spoke of something my father wanted to say, and read it again. "Listen to the sea one last time before you go." The words stayed with me. I began wondering if she'd hidden something there, some message I'd missed. The thought grew until it became a pulse under my skin. I started thinking about driving back, just once, before the renovations were complete. Maybe if I stood there, I'd understand. When I mentioned it to her, she surprised me. "Take me with you," she said. Her eyes were clear for the first time in days. "I need to say goodbye properly." "It's a long drive, Mom. Maybe next week." She reached out, gripping my wrist with unexpected strength. "If we wait, it won't be there to say goodbye to." So we went. I told myself it was for her, but it was for both of us. We drove through the night, the city fading behind us until only the ribbon of road and the smell of salt remained. Around dawn, the ocean appeared, a wide, silver sheet stretching beyond the cliffs. For a moment, I felt something loosen in my chest. But when we arrived, I almost turned the car around. The house was unrecognizable. The porch was gone, replaced by scaffolding. The windows were boarded up, the garden stripped bare. A dumpster sat where my father's workshop had been, filled with splintered wood and broken tiles. My mother's breath hitched. "They're killing it," she whispered. She stepped out of the car before I could stop her, walking toward the ruins as if pulled by an invisible thread. Workers glanced at us but said nothing. She stopped in front of the doorway, only a frame now, and pressed her palm against it. "This is where he kissed me goodbye the morning the boat sank," she said. Her voice trembled, but she didn't cry. "He said the sea was calm." It lied. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to pull her away, to protect her from the sight of it, but she turned to me instead. "You need to listen now, Sam." "Listen to what?" "The sea. You still haven't listened." I followed her gaze to the bluff. The tide was coming in, foaming against the rocks below. The sound was enormous, endless layers of water colliding, withdrawing, returning. Beneath it, I thought I heard something softer, almost like a voice carried in the wind. I closed my eyes, and for a second, I swear I heard my father's laugh, low and distant. It wasn't possible, but it broke something open in me. When I looked back, Mom was gone. Panic ripped through me. I ran toward the edge, scanning the cliff, calling her name. Then I saw her down the slope, standing dangerously close to the drop, her robe snapping in the wind. "Mom!" I shouted. She turned, smiling. "He's not gone, you know. He's just waiting where the water turns over." I reached her just as her foot slipped on the wet grass. I grabbed her arm, pulled her back hard. She gasped, startled, and for a moment her clarity returned, frightened, aware. "I almost followed him," she whispered. "It's so easy to forget you're still on land." We sat there in the damp grass, holding each other, the sea roaring beneath us. I wanted to hate it, but all I felt was awe, its power, its hunger, its mercy. It had taken my father, was taking my mother piece by piece, and somehow still it was beautiful. As we drove back toward the city, she slept again, head resting on my shoulder. The sun came up behind us, lighting the road gold. I realized I hadn't cried yet, not really. The tears stayed somewhere deep, waiting for permission. For a while after that visit, my mother seemed almost lighter, as if the sea had taken some weight from her. She stopped fighting the forgetting and instead drifted through the days with a kind of fragile grace. Some mornings she would mistake me for my father again, but the panic was gone from her confusion. "Leo, you came back," she would whisper, smiling, and I'd nod because correcting her felt crueler than the lie. The apartment grew quieter. The radio gathered dust, the kettle stayed cold. She started sitting on the balcony for hours, staring at the city skyline as though she could will it into waves. I'd hear her talking softly to herself, or to him, words I couldn't catch, sentences shaped like prayer. At night I would replay that moment on the cliff over and over, the way her robe whipped in the wind, her eyes filled with that terrible peace. I told myself she was safe now, but something inside me knew safety was not what she wanted. She wanted return, to him, to the house, to the water that remembered her name even when her own mind did not. The guilt grew restless inside me. I began driving to the coast on weekends, alone. I'd park a mile from the property so no one would see me and walk along the beach until I reached the bluff. The new owners had finished rebuilding by then. Their version of the house stood taller, glassier, immaculate, no trace of salt or memory. It looked like a stranger wearing my childhood's skin. I'd stand below it, watching the lights flicker through the windows, listening to children's laughter carried by the wind. It was beautiful, but wrong. The ocean broke against the rocks the same as it always had, but it sounded colder now, metallic, like it was echoing inside an empty shell. Sometimes I imagined my father standing beside me, hands in his pockets, squinting at the new facade. "You did what you had to, son," I could almost hear him say. But the voice that followed was always hers. Sometimes what we call protection is just fear wearing clean clothes. One evening, when I returned to the apartment, she was gone. Her coat was missing, the door unlocked. Panic set in fast, the kind that drowns reason. I called the neighbors, the police, anyone who might have seen an elderly woman in slippers wandering the street. It was after midnight when they found her, 2 blocks away, sitting on a park bench, humming to herself. When I reached her, she looked up, surprised to see me. "Sam," she asked softly, "why are you crying?" Because I was terrified, because I was failing, because I was losing her one memory at a time. But all I said was, "You scared me, Mom." She smiled. "Don't be scared, love. I wasn't lost. I was just walking home. Home is back there, I said, pointing toward the apartment. She shook her head. Not that one. The other one. After that night, she faded quickly. The doctor said it wasn't unusual, how the mind, once it begins to unravel, sometimes does so all at once, like a thread pulled too far. I took time off work to stay with her, filling the rooms with soft music, keeping the lights warm, pretending the air still smelled of the sea. Some days she didn't speak at all. On others, she talked for hours, weaving memories and dreams into stories that made no sense yet felt true. The waves were singing yesterday, she told me once, eyes shining. They said he's waiting. There's room for both of us. I tried to smile, but my throat closed. That night, I found myself pacing the living room long after she'd fallen asleep. The city outside was hushed. I pulled out the letter again, the one she'd written before we left. Listen to the sea one last time before you go. What if it wasn't a metaphor? What if she'd meant it literally? An irrational thought, but it clung to me. I began hearing the sea everywhere, in the hum of the refrigerator, the rush of traffic, the whisper of rain against the window. It was as if the ocean had followed me inland, whispering reminders of what I'd taken. A week later, the nurse called while I was at the office. You should come, she said quietly. Your mother's asking for you. When I arrived, the nurse met me at the door, eyes kind but knowing. She's been drifting in and out, she said. Talking about the water again. I went to her room. She was lying in bed, pale, the afternoon light slanting across her face. Her hands were folded neatly on her chest, and for a moment I thought she was asleep. Then her eyes opened, soft and clear. Sam, she whispered. Do you still have the letter? Yes. Good. Then you'll know where to go. Go where? Her lips curved in the faintest smile. Back to where you started. I took her hand. I shouldn't have sold it. You did what love told you to, she murmured. Just remember, love isn't always gentle. Her eyes closed again, but she kept talking, voice barely above breath. When it's time, don't be afraid to listen. He'll be there. We both will. Those were the last words she ever said to me. She passed 2 nights later, quietly, as if slipping beneath a calm tide. I sat beside her until the nurse came in, unable to move, unable to understand how still a body could be after holding so much life. The city hummed outside, indifferent. At dawn, I opened the balcony door. The air was dry, but in it I thought I smelled salt. For a long time I stood there, eyes closed, waiting for the sound of waves that never came. The drive back to the coast felt longer than it ever had, though the road was the same cracked asphalt, the same leaning fences, the same trees bending toward the ocean wind. Yet everything around me seemed quieter, as if the world itself knew I was bringing her home. Her ashes sat on the passenger seat in a small wooden urn, plain and unpolished. I'd chosen it because it reminded me of the kitchen table she'd loved, the one with the coffee ring she refused to sand off because imperfection gives wood its soul. As I drove, the sky turned the color of faded denim. The radio played something soft, old, and trembling, a song she used to hum when she cooked. I could almost see her in the passenger seat, red lipstick, wind in her hair, laughing as she told me to slow down around the bends. For a moment, I let myself believe she was really there, and that we were just going home together after a long time apart. By the time I reached the coast, the sun was dipping low. The air was colder, sharper. I parked near the cliffs, the same spot where I'd stood so many times before, staring up at what used to be our house. Only now it looked even more like a stranger, taller, newer, and utterly soulless. A family was outside, barbecuing in the yard where my father used to hang a rope swing. 2 children ran through the grass, laughing, chasing each other around a golden retriever. It should have been comforting, seeing life there again. But instead, I felt a pang so deep it left me breathless, the kind that comes when something beautiful continues without you. I took the urn and walked down the narrow trail toward the water. The path was half eroded, the railing rusted. The rocks below gleamed dark with tide. When I reached the shore, I sat on a driftwood log and listened, really listened. The sea was restless that evening, 1,000 sighs colliding. Every wave carried memory, my mother calling me for dinner, my father's voice singing off-key, the smell of sunscreen and salt. It all felt impossibly close and impossibly far. I opened the urn. Inside, her ashes were fine and grey, like the sand at low tide. My hands shook, not from the wind but from the sudden weight of what I was holding, not just her remains, but everything I could never return to her. I'm sorry, I whispered. For selling it. For taking you away. For not understanding until now. The words felt too small for the ache they carried. The sea responded with a long, rolling wave that came close enough to kiss my shoes, as if answering. I scattered her ashes into it, slow at first, then all at once. The wind caught some, spinning them upward like silver dust, and for a fleeting second, the air glittered. Then she was gone, or maybe she was finally everywhere. I stayed there long after the tide had risen, long after the light began to fade. When the horizon turned to indigo, I pulled out the letter again, the one she'd told me to keep. I'd read it so many times the paper had gone soft at the edges, but that night I noticed something I hadn't before, faint indentations on the back, as though she'd written something and then erased it. I held it up to the moonlight and traced the marks with my thumb. If you ever come back, listen to the house. It remembers more than I do. The words were ghostly, almost invisible, but they were hers. And they changed everything. The next morning, I went to see the family who lived there now. I don't know what I expected, maybe to beg them for a few minutes alone inside, or to just touch the walls one last time. A woman answered the door, polite but cautious, a towel slung over her shoulder. "Hi," I said, trying not to sound like someone who'd lost his mind. "My name's Sam Keller. My parents built this house a long time ago. I used to live here." Her expression softened. "Oh, you're the Keller boy. We've heard stories from the neighbors. Would you like to come in?" I hesitated, but she stepped aside, and I crossed the threshold. The smell hit me first, clean linen, citrus candles, nothing like salt or wood smoke. But beneath it, faintly, there was something older, something that hadn't left. The rooms were different. The walls were white, the floors sleek. The porch had been replaced with glass doors, the kitchen rearranged completely. But when I reached the center beam, the one my father had carved our initials into, my heart stuttered. They'd sanded it smooth and painted over it, but the carving was still there, faintly visible beneath the layers. M+L+S. I ran my fingers over it. The grooves were shallow now, but my skin remembered every curve of those letters. The woman stood beside me, quiet. "It's strange," she said softly. "Sometimes at night, the floor creaks in that spot, like someone's walking. My husband says it's just the wood settling, but I always thought maybe it's something else." I smiled faintly. "Maybe it's memory." Before I left, she handed me something. "We found this in the crawl space when we were renovating. I thought it might belong to your family." It was an old Polaroid, the colors almost gone. My mother stood on the porch, hair wild in the wind, my father beside her holding a hammer. I was in front of them, maybe 6 years old, covered in sand and grinning like the world was brand new. I thanked her, though my voice barely worked, and walked back to the bluff. The tide was rising again. I looked down at the picture one last time before tucking it into my jacket. The sea below glimmered, vast and endless, and for the first time, I understood what my mother had meant, that the house wasn't the wood or the paint or the land. It was us. It was everything we'd ever loved echoing through the waves. As I stood there, the wind shifted, carrying the faintest sound, a laugh, low and familiar, drifting up from the water. For a second, I thought I imagined it. But then I heard it again, soft as breath. I didn't call out. I just closed my eyes, let the sound wash through me, and whispered into the wind. "I'm home." I didn't go home after that night on the bluff. Something inside me refused to leave the coast again, at least not until I understood what my mother had meant by those last words. When it's time, don't be afraid to listen. He'll be there. We both will. So I rented a small cabin a few miles down the beach, a weathered, one-room place with cracked windows and the sound of waves seeping through every wall. I told myself I'd stay for a few days, maybe a week. But time blurred quickly near the ocean, stretching and folding like the tide. Days became weeks. Each morning I'd walk the shore at dawn, tracing the same path my father used to take when he checked the tides. The seaweed, the driftwood, the shells, they all seemed to arrange themselves differently each day, as if the ocean were trying to tell me a story in its own slow, patient language. At night, I'd sit outside with a flask of cheap whiskey, the cold biting at my fingers, and stare toward the house that had once been ours. The new family's lights glowed like a distant constellation. Sometimes I could hear faint laughter from their porch, the same kind that used to float from ours. It didn't hurt anymore, not in the sharp, bitter way it once had. It was something quieter now, something like acceptance. But then the dreams started. In the first one, I was standing in the kitchen of the old house. Everything was just as it had been. The yellow curtains, the chipped sink, the smell of my mother's tea. But the window was open, and the sea outside was wild. My father was there, sitting at the table, sanding a piece of driftwood. He looked up, smiling. "Took you long enough," he said. When I tried to speak, no sound came. He pointed toward the window. "You've been carrying her too long, son. Let her go. She's already home." I woke up drenched in sweat, the sound of waves pounding in my chest like a second heartbeat. That morning, I drove to the edge of the bluff again. The wind was sharp, cutting. I stood there until my ears rang with the roar of the sea. My mother's letter, the real one, not the erased version, was still folded in my pocket. I took it out and read it again, slowly, out loud this time, letting the words fall into the wind. "My dearest Sam, if you're reading this, it means the sea has called you back. Don't fight it. You can't. There are things you were too young to know when your father died. Things I kept to protect you, or maybe to protect myself. But you deserve to know the truth about that night." The words blurred. I blinked hard, the paper trembling in my hands. "Your father didn't fall from the cliff by accident." My breath caught. The world tilted slightly, as if the ground itself had shifted under me. "He went to the edge because I asked him to. Not to die, but to hear the sea. We'd been fighting for weeks. About money, about selling the house, about how everything beautiful in our life seemed to be slipping away. That night, I told him I couldn't stay here anymore, not after the storms, not after the cracks in the foundation. He said the sea would never take us if we still belonged to it. Then he walked outside. I followed him, and the wind was howling, the waves furious. He turned to me and said, 'You'll see, Maggie. It knows our names.' I don't remember much after that. Just the wind, his hand reaching for mine, and then, nothing. They said it was an accident. Maybe it was. But I've never been sure." The letter ended there, unfinished. My hands went numb. I stared at the paper, waiting for more words that never came. For years, I'd told myself his death was random, a cruel twist of fate, the sea claiming what it wanted. But now it felt like something older, deeper, and unbearably human. They'd loved each other so much that even their ending was tangled with it. And maybe that's why she could never leave that house. Maybe that's why she stayed long after it was safe, long after her memory began to fade. She wasn't waiting for me. She was waiting for him. I sank to the ground, the letter clutched against my chest, and for the first time in decades, I wept like a child, loud, unrestrained, raw. The kind of crying that doesn't ask for comfort, only release. When the tears finally stopped, I looked up at the sky. The clouds had thinned, streaked with gold and violet. The wind had softened. I thought I heard a whisper in the distance, not words exactly, but something close. A rhythm, a pulse. The sea was calling. That evening, I went back to the water's edge. The tide was rising fast, foam licking at my shoes. I took off my jacket and let the wind tear through me. For the first time, I didn't resist it. "Dad," I said into the wind. "I know now." The waves answered with a low, rolling thunder. "And Mom, I brought you home." A sudden gust rose from the sea, fierce and warm, wrapping around me like breath. And in that moment, I felt it, them. Not as ghosts, not as memories, but as something alive, something elemental. The air shimmered. I closed my eyes. When I opened them, the horizon was glowing faintly, a soft, impossible light hovering just above the waves. I knew it wasn't real, not in the way the world defines real. But to me, it was truer than anything else. The sea calmed. The light faded. And what was left was silence, deep, forgiving silence. I stayed in that cabin through the winter. Some nights, I could hear the waves whispering against the rocks, a low hum that sounded almost like voices. I began recording them, at first to prove to myself it wasn't just in my head. But when I played the recordings back, they were empty. Just wind and water. Still, I knew what I'd heard. I started writing letters to them both. Small ones. Little fragments of thought. The house is still standing. The gulls still fight over the same rock. I finally understand why you loved it here. I never mailed them, of course. I burned them one by one on the shore, watching the ashes rise and drift away, just like hers had. And somehow, with each one, I felt lighter. The last letter I wrote was different. It wasn't to them. It was to myself. You are not what you've lost. You are what remains. And what remains is enough. When I finished, I folded it neatly and placed it inside the Polaroid I'd kept of the three of us. Then I buried it beneath the sand at the edge of the bluff, the same spot where my father had once stood. The sea moved quietly below, as if listening. Months later, I finally left the coast. Not because I wanted to, but because I no longer needed to stay. Before I drove away, I stopped one last time at the overlook. The house gleamed in the distance, windows reflecting the sun. The wind was cool and steady. I didn't feel anger anymore. Or guilt. Just a deep, abiding peace, the kind that comes when the past finally exhales. As I turned to go, a memory rose, unbidden. My mother's voice from years ago, calling through the open window. "Dinner's ready, Sammy. Come wash up." For a heartbeat, I almost answered her. Then I smiled, let the sound dissolve into the wind, and whispered, "I'm coming, Mom." Not to follow her, but to live in a way that would make her proud. To build something new, something that carried the sound of the sea without needing to own it. And as I walked back to my car, the waves broke once, loud and clear, like applause, or maybe farewell. It's strange how silence can sound different once you've made peace with it. For months after I left the coast, I couldn't fall asleep without the ocean's rhythm in my ears. I'd play recordings of waves on my phone, but they never felt right. The sound was there, but the soul was missing. Now, a year later, I live 3 blocks from a river that cuts through the heart of the city. It's not the sea, not really, but sometimes when the wind moves just right, it carries the faint scent of salt from far away. I like to think it's her way of visiting. I still work in real estate, but not the same kind. I stopped building towers that touch the sky and started restoring old homes instead, places that remember, that have bones and whispers and warmth. I've learned that some houses breathe differently. You just have to listen. People ask me sometimes why I don't go back to the beach house. I tell them I already did. But what I don't say, what I never say, is that I still see it sometimes, even when I'm nowhere near the ocean. In reflections, in dreams, in the shimmer that dances on puddles after it rains. It's not just a place anymore. It's a presence. A rhythm that lives quietly inside me. There's a little antique store I visit every Sunday. It's owned by a woman named Clara, mid-60s, sharp-eyed, kind. She always greets me with a knowing smile, as if she recognizes something familiar in my silence. One morning, while browsing, I found an old typewriter tucked in the corner. It was the same model my mother used when she wrote her short stories, the same clack of keys I'd fallen asleep to as a boy. When I told Clara that, she tilted her head and said, "Then I think it's waiting for you." I bought it that day and brought it home. It sits on a small wooden desk by my window, overlooking the river. Sometimes I write letters I never send. Sometimes I just let the keys click for the sake of sound, that small, rhythmic music of memory. Lately, I've been writing about the house. Not as it was, or even as it became, but as it felt. How the sunlight always found my mother's face when she cooked. How my father would whistle without realizing it. How every argument somehow ended with laughter because none of us knew how to stay angry for long. I write about how the floorboards creaked differently depending on who was walking, how the air smelled after a storm, how the ocean used to sound like forgiveness when the world got too loud. Sometimes I wonder if I'm trying to rebuild the house out of words. Maybe I am. Maybe that's what memory really is, rebuilding something after the sea has taken it. One night, after a long day, I was walking home through the park when it started to rain. The city lights blurred through the drops, golden and soft. The river swelled gently, carrying leaves and light like tiny boats. I stopped on the bridge and just listened. The rain, the wind, the slow, steady pull of water. It wasn't the ocean, but it was close. And for a brief, impossible moment, I heard her voice again. "Do you still have the letter?" she asked. "Yes," I whispered. "Good. Then you'll know where to go." I closed my eyes and smiled. She hadn't meant the beach house. She'd meant this, wherever love led, wherever peace waited. That was home. The next morning, I placed the letter in a small glass frame on my desk. Not as a wound, but as a reminder, even things that end can still guide you forward. Spring came slowly that year. The river thawed, the air turned sweeter. On the first warm afternoon, I took a long walk to a nearby park where children were flying kites. One of them, a little girl with dark curls, lost her grip, and the kite drifted upward, bright against the sky. I watched it climb higher and higher, the ribbon twisting in the sunlight, and something inside me ached, not from sorrow, but from beauty. It was the same feeling I used to have as a child, standing on the porch watching the gulls. That mix of awe and smallness. That knowledge that the world moves on, and that's okay. A boy beside me said to his sister, "It's gone." She shook her head. "No, It's just flying home. I turned away quickly, afraid they might see the tears gathering in my eyes. Months later, I received a letter in the mail with no return address. The handwriting was old-fashioned, looping and careful. Inside was a photograph, one of the same Polaroids from the beach house, only this one was different. It showed the three of us again, but in this photo, my father wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at my mother. She was mid-laugh, head tilted back, sunlight on her hair. And in the bottom corner, scrawled in fading ink, were 3 words. Still listening. L. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The handwriting was unmistakably his. I turned the photo over, half expecting an explanation, but there was nothing else. Just blank paper and the faint smell of sea salt, though I knew that was impossible. I set it by the typewriter and stared at it for a long time. The rational part of me searched for logic. Perhaps the new family had found it and mailed it. Maybe someone had discovered it in the foundation. But another part of me, the one that had learned to listen, simply nodded. The sea doesn't forget. And maybe, neither do the ones we love. I started visiting the coast again, but not the house. I never stepped onto that bluff again. Instead, I'd stop miles away, where the cliffs were low and the waves softer. I'd walk barefoot in the surf, close my eyes, and let the water circle my ankles. Sometimes, if the wind was calm, I'd speak out loud, not to anyone, just to the air. I'd tell them about my work, about the river, about the children with their kites. I'd tell them I was okay. And always, without fail, the waves would shift just enough to touch my feet. A quiet answer. A gentle reminder. That's how I learned to live with it, not by holding on, but by listening. One evening, as the sun set in molten gold, I saw a woman standing where the tide met the rocks. She was older, silver hair loose, wearing a long linen dress. For a moment, I thought it was her, my mother, exactly as she'd looked in her last lucid years. I blinked, and she was gone. Just the shimmer of light on the waves where she'd been. But instead of sadness, I felt warmth spread through me, the same warmth that used to fill the kitchen when the oven door opened and the smell of bread filled the house. I whispered, "Thank you," and the wind carried it away. It's been 5 years now. The river outside my window keeps flowing, endlessly forward, and I've come to believe that's what we are, rivers wearing human faces. Always moving, always returning to the sea eventually. I keep a small jar of sand on my desk, collected from the beach below the old house. It's not much, just a handful of grains, light and ordinary. But when the sunlight hits it, it glows. Like memory. Like forgiveness. Sometimes, people visit and ask what it is. Just a bit of home, I tell them. And they always nod, even if they don't understand. If I've learned anything, it's that loss doesn't take love away, it reveals it. It shows you the shape of what mattered, the echo that remains. And if you're quiet long enough, if you listen the way my parents taught me to, you'll hear it too, that faint hum beneath everything. It's not grief. It's love, remembering itself. So I listen. Every morning. Every night. When the city sleeps, when the river moves, when the wind slips through the window just right, I still hear them. Her laugh. His whistle. The soft rhythm of waves against wood. The house by the sea lives on, not as a place, but as a pulse. And sometimes, when the air tastes faintly of salt, I smile and whisper to the quiet. I'm still listening.